Wszystko zaczęło się od króla Jagiełły. Mała Łodzia stała się miastem, które w XIX wieku rozwijało się najszybciej na świecie. W ciągu zaledwie 60 lat od powstania pierwszej manufaktury powstaje przemysłowa, wielonarodowościowa metropolia. Jednak wiatry historii nie zawsze jej sprzyjały. To, co zniszczył los, odbudowują łodzianie. Nasza Łódź. Miasto wielkich szans. Od 600 lat w sercu Polski i Europy.
Jesteśmy Polakami. Jesteśmy niezwykłym społeczeństwem. Zawsze w obliczu wielkiego wyzwania potrafimy się mobilizować. Potrafimy stawić czoła wielkim wyzwaniom. Bo nie potrafimy stać obojętnie. Bo obchodzi nas bezpieczeństwo i przyszłość naszych dzieci. Bo wierzymy, że nadzieja zwycięża apatię, lęk i strach. Bo mimo wszelkich przeciwności nigdy się nie poddajemy. Potrafimy ciężko pracować, wspierać się i działać razem. Bo zależy nam na naszej ojczyźnie, naszym osiedlu, naszej ulicy. Bo chcemy naszych niezbywalnych praw i wolności. Bo nie oddamy naszych marzeń. Nadchodzi punkt zwrotny.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next presentation will be devoted to democratic freedom and its enemies and will be delivered by Michael Ignatieff, born in Canada, educated at the University in Toronto and Harvard. He is the university professor, writer, and former politician. Between 2006-2011, Michael Ignatieff was the MP in Canada and then the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and the leader of the official opposition. Between 2014-2016, he was the Edward R. Murrow Chair of the Press, Politics and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Michael Ignatieff was recently director and president of the Central European University in Budapest. He quit the position at the end of July 2021 and remained a professor at the Department of History, Democratic Freedom and its Enemies. Michael Ignatieff, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm lucky to have followed Deirdre McCloskey, who gave you such an unforgettable definition of what liberal freedom is. I want to pick up and talk about democratic freedom, and I want to raise an embarrassing problem, which is the opponents of democratic freedom, the opponents of the liberal definition of freedom, use the words freedom and democracy too. What kind of freedom do they mean when they talk about freedom? What kind of democracy do they talk about when they talk about democracy? The unsettling thing about democracy is that it's a constant argument about what democracy is. It's a constant argument about what freedom is. And I want to talk to you about some of those arguments. There's no such thing, to begin with the idea that democratic freedom can be discussed in the abstract. Professors like to do that, but professors shouldn't do that. Democratic freedom is always historically specific to the society in which it's rooted. And there's no better example of that than Poland. You have an absolutely unique experience of democratic freedom. You've had to fight for it. The Russian Empire took it away at the end of the 18th century. You didn't win it back until 1918, you lost it again in 1945, you fought to regain it in 1989, and now you have Russia nearby trying to crush the freedom of your neighbor, and you've got an election in a month's time, which many of you feel is decisive for the future of your democracy. The embarrassing difficulty for liberals, and the thing we need to understand, is that no one, not even liberals, owns democracy. No one owns freedom. The nature of democratic debate is a constant argument, a fierce argument about what these words mean. Polls disagree vitally about democratic freedom, and it may be the central issue in the campaign. Both sides believe that they are defending freedom. For one side of the argument, freedom means freedom from foreign interference, freedom from Brussels, freedom to choose your own rulers, freedom to preserve language, culture, and tradition from unwelcome outside pressure and influence. The other side of the argument thinks freedom as national self-determination matters crucially, but it matters because what you want to defend is personal freedom, individual freedom, the freedom to think for yourself, the freedom to travel, the freedom to see the world, the freedom to think for yourself, to create, imagine, and live your own life. So there are two freedoms at stake here. They're not one. A collective freedom of collective self-determination, and an individual freedom, individual self-determination, and they're fighting it out inside your democracy. And this means, oddly enough, that one of the greatest enemies of freedom is freedom. So in the current election, one side speaks on behalf of a collective freedom of Poland to rule itself as a democratic state and protect its culture and identity. But this use of freedom might threaten the individual freedom of women to control their fertility, marry whom they please. It might threaten gays and trans people. So what freedom means to them might be tyranny for you. And just as there are a couple of different competing meanings of freedom, it's the same with democracy. One definition of democracy, which you all know, is its majority rule. The purpose of democracy is to preserve culture, identity, and national sovereignty, the collective. The second, and this is the liberal definition of democracy, is completely different. It's power, checking power, to keep the people free. The purpose of democracy is freedom, to safeguard the freedom of individuals from the tyranny of the majority and the abuse of power by government. And that's why, in certain ways, the greatest enemy of democracy is democracy itself. The greatest enemy is the use of democracy to abolish democracy, to use democracy to curtail the freedom which is what democracy is for. The best way to weaken individual freedom is to claim that what you're doing represents the will of the majority. And an autocrat's most dangerous claim is, the people are behind me. So this is what's really at stake in every election, but especially in this election. It's not just who wins or loses, but whether the argument itself gets to continue, whether those who may lose this time get the chance to win next time. And to be a Democrat, to be a genuine Democrat all the way down, is to understand that these arguments are what democracy is for, and that the argument never ends. And if any of you are tempted to hope for an end to the argument, for final victory over your opponents, to silence your opponents once and for all, you're not a democrat. What you're hoping for is tyranny. Let me talk a little bit more about how the use of democratic rhetoric and the rhetoric of freedom can end up destroying democracy. My example is Hungary. I'm married to a Hungarian, by the way, and for 5 years I was rector of Central European University in Budapest until Viktor Orban defined us as public enemy number one, and after a fierce battle threw us out. Poles don't need to be told how much your current regime has learned from Viktor Orban, or that both of you have very similar political traditions. You both had to build democracy on the ruins of a communist political culture and an authoritarian tradition going back into the 30s. You both joined the EU in 2004, and you hoped that membership in the EU would anchor democracy in Poland, partly by having an external check on the folly of your own politicians. It didn't turn out that way. Ivan Krastev, the Bulgarian analyst and a friend of many people in this room, once said, and I think it's a brilliant remark, that one of the worst mistakes that Western Europe made in respect of Eastern Europe was to assume that you folks wanted to be Western Europeans. You didn't want to be Western Europeans. You wanted to be Poles, but with a Western standard of living. And so an enormous resentment arose in Eastern Europe at the condescension of Western Europeans towards your national identity, your national project, your national vision, your national languages. And the people who absolutely heard that resentment were the authoritarian nationalists. And one of the sober lessons for liberals is we lost the national register. We lost the patriotic register. Somehow we didn't end up standing for a vision of Hungary and Poland at the heart of Europe, but also fiercely and strongly Polish and Hungarian. I'm talking from an outside point of view. You may disagree, but that's how I see why Orban and Kaczynski have been so successful. They've got a lock on a certain patriotic national discourse. The other mistake that Western Europe made, besides condescending to you, was believing that the EU would keep you on the democratic path. And what they didn't see was the ways in which nationalist demagogues, Orban and Kaczynski particularly, but Mečiar, many of the others, were able to blame Brussels for the high cost of the democratic transition. And so you have the grotesque spectacle, especially grotesque in Hungary, of Viktor Orban campaigning against Brussels, calling Brussels Moscow Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and on Saturday cashing the checks from Brussels. It's this double game, a cynical double game that in fact the Hungarian public has become collusive in. And this game may be going on in your country. And beyond this game, you know how you use democracy, a democratic mandate, to weaken democracy. Orban's done it, Kaczynski's done it. You rewrite the Constitution, you pack the court with your justices, you stack the electoral system to hurt the opposition. You consider politics as a form of war, and so you brand your opponents as traitors, as enemies of the people. You take control of the state media, you marginalize the free media that remains, and you stigmatize all external criticism from the outside as an attack on the people and the nation. You know all this. You've lived this. I lived it in Hungary. But the painful part, the part we have to understand is that it has massive public support, or sufficient public support to give Viktor Orban 4 successive election victories. In other words, he's won that by legitimizing this as democracy, legitimizing this as the will and voice of the people. Now, there has emerged a difference between Orban and Kaczynski, which is extremely important, or a difference between Polish opinion and Hungarian opinion, which is extremely important, which is raised by the issue of Ukraine. Orban is the only member of NATO, only member of the EU to essentially collude with Putin's war on Ukrainian democratic freedom. And I think Poles understand instinctively how deeply wrong that is. I find it astonishing that it's occurring in a country. My wife remembers hearing the sound of the tank tracks of Soviet tanks in the street of her town in '56. That's a sound you don't forget. And somehow the Hungarian people are going along with collusion in the destruction of the democracy of a people on their very border. And again, what's disturbing is this has democratic support. Orban is not on his own. He has support in the country for these politics, which seem to me to be an abomination. Now, you're in the middle of an election campaign about these and other issues, and you're in the grip of what I would call the politics of enemies. Mr. Kaczynski calls Mr. Tusk an enemy of the people. Mr. Tusk replies by calling Mr. Kaczynski an enemy of the people. And this is the politics of enemies. I would observe how damaging this is for democracy itself. Democracy, the genius of democracy when it works well, is that it manages competition for power as a competition not between enemies who want to destroy you, but between adversaries who compete for power but are willing to accept the result and seek to compete again. An adversary only wants to compete with you. An enemy wants to destroy you. A democracy that is divided by a politics of enemies is a democracy that has a very, very great difficulty of recovering from the bitterness of election campaigns. Democratic politics is supposed to bring people together in a collective display of their authority, but instead a politics of enemies is dividing the country, rural against urban, young against old, secular versus religious, high income versus low income. And the problem with the politics of enemies is that it works. And it has the devastating effect on democracy of convincing many voters that authoritarian solutions are the answer to democracy's problems. Because an authoritarian will put a stop to all this conflict, all this division, all this argument, bring us all together. The politics of enemies, by slow steps, can take you to an authoritarian result you did not intend. And that's why it's truly dangerous for liberals to succumb to that politics. And a politics of enemies works in another way. It suppresses votes. People say, oh, I'm tired of the argument. I'm sick of this fighting. Let's stay home. To hell with all of them. And when you do that, you get the worst of all possible results. So those who win the election will have to pick up the pieces, and those who lose it will have to start all over again. And when the stakes are this high, it becomes easy to start hating your fellow citizens. Why do they vote for these people? Don't they realize the harm they're doing to our country? And this issue of hatred for those you disagree with is a real issue. It's an issue increasingly in the United States, and it may be an issue in Poland. I hope the opposition wins, if I can declare a personal preference, but what if they don't? Do you end up disliking your fellow citizens, giving up on democracy, sliding back into private life, concluding you're right and everybody else is wrong? What you risk doing when you do that is sliding back to what in the communist times was called inner immigration. You live in the country, but you're now no longer of the country. You've seceded. It's a terrible thing, a bitter thing, to live in a country where the other side appears to control everything. I should know, we were thrown out of Hungary, and my wife Susanna feels it toxic to be back in the land of her birth. But it's very important to resist that sense of hatred for the people you're competing with in politics. And the other thing I think is terribly important, everybody in the room is telling me this is a linchpin election, a key election. Fine. I've lived so long, I know there's always another key election right after this one. It never stops, folks. It goes on. And the test of your faith in democracy is not when it delivers the results you want, but when it doesn't. I should know, I ran an election and lost badly. It's when you lose that you have to decide whether you really believe in democracy. And one of the democracy's biggest problems is that it has no natural constituency. People want their party to win, but they don't necessarily care that democracy wins. And I think we need to recall why we care about democracy, not simply because it gives us the result we want, gets the people in office that we want. It's the only system in the world that respects you as an agent, that says it's up to you. It's the only political system that addresses you as a sovereign individual and purports to respect you as an individual. The problem with the democratic campaigns we witness everywhere is that they are so full of lies, so full of manipulation, so full of viciousness, that democracy itself is deeply tarnished. You never feel, as a citizen, that you're being addressed as a sovereign choosing individual. And this is how you can lose democracy. If democracy ceases to address you as a sovereign individual, you stop caring about democracy. But what matters more than who wins or loses in next month's election is democracy itself. The institutions that represent you, the checks and balances that keep power in check, the flow of information that allows you to make free choices, and the rules that everyone has to obey, rich or poor. I guess I'm saying make democracy, not party, your ultimate allegiance. Figure out for yourself which kind of freedom you mean, which kind of freedom you value, that collective freedom, that individual freedom. What idea of democracy do you care about? Majority rule or power, checking power to keep the people free? You've got a choice of party, but you've also got a choice of understanding what the hell these words mean to you. And finally, remember, the battle's never over. The battle's never over. This election is important, but there'll be other elections that are important. And if you have a longer perspective, you realize your job as a parent, your job as a young person is to ensure that there will be democracy for your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. That's the stake in this and in every election. Thanks for listening.